You type a message, read it again, delete half of it, add an emoji to soften it. No one called you aggressive. Still, you correct yourself before there's even a problem. You live anticipating rejection that hasn't happened. When someone takes too long to reply, you pretend you don't care. You do, and you start replaying everything you said. You're not calm. You're tense in silence. You pride yourself on being balanced, but you spend your entire day policing your tone, your reactions, your impact. That's not maturity. It's fear of what might come out if you stop holding the brakes. And the worst part? This controlled version of you is already making your decisions. Stay. This is going to sting a little more. You press your jaw without noticing. Your teeth stay locked even when no one is talking to you. Your fingers scroll. Stop. Scroll again! You reread a message that wasn't aggressive, but your chest tightens anyway. You inhale, shallow, hold, release like you're bracing for impact. No one is attacking you. Still, your body behaves as if something is about to explode. And sometimes it does. Not publicly, not in dramatic scenes, but in small fractures, a tone that sharpens. A silence that punishes. A door closed a little harder than necessary. You call it stress. You call it a long day. You call it just being tired. But your nervous system doesn't lie. There is something inside you that doesn't feel safe. And you don't know exactly what it is. So you manage it. You control your words carefully. You rehearse conversations in your head. You try to anticipate what could go wrong before it does. You pride yourself on being emotionally stable, on not being one of those people who lose control. But your stability feels tense, like a glass of water filled to the edge. Like one more drop would spill everything. You don't scream, you don't collapse, you don't break down in public. You function, you deliver, you respond politely, and then alone, you replay everything. What you should have said, what you swallowed, what you pretended didn't bother you. Your body keeps score, shoulders tight, stomach burning, mind racing at 2 a.m. And the strangest part? You don't even know what you're holding in. You just know you can't fully relax. Even during good moments, something in you stays alert. Scanning, measuring, preparing. Preparing for what? You don't know. But your reactions are faster than your awareness. A minor criticism feels like humiliation. A delayed reply feels like rejection. A small disagreement feels like disrespect. And when you react, it's never proportional. Either you shut down completely, or something sharp escapes before you can stop it. Then comes the guilt, the self-correction, the promise. I'll handle it better next time. But next time comes, and the pattern repeats. Because what you think is control might actually be suppression. And what you call maturity might be fear wearing discipline as a mask. There is a part of you don't look at. Not because you're bad, but because somewhere along the way, you decided certain emotions were unacceptable. Anger, jealousy, neediness, resentment. You buried them. You refined yourself. You became reasonable. And yet, something inside you keeps leaking through the cracks. In your tone, in your choices, in the people you tolerate. You believe you are directing your life. But what if something you've pushed away is quietly pulling the strings? What if the part of you refuse to acknowledge is the part making the decisions? And if that's true, who is really in control right now? You tell yourself you're self-aware. You reflect. You analyze. You try to improve. You don't deny your flaws. At least, not the acceptable ones. You admit you can be impatient. You admit you overthink. You admit you care too much. But notice something. The traits you confess are socially forgivable. They don't threaten your identity. They don't expose the parts of you that feel dangerous. Because real instability doesn't look chaotic. It looks controlled. It looks composed on the outside and rigid on the inside. You don't rage publicly. You simmer privately. You don't beg. You withdraw. You don't collapse. You become colder. And then you call that strength. You built an image of yourself as someone rational, balanced, reliable, but that image requires maintenance, constant maintenance. You measure your reactions before expressing them, you edit your feelings before admitting them, you shrink certain impulses before they're even fully formed, not because you're enlightened, Because you're afraid of what might happen if you don't. Afraid of being too much, too emotional, too intense, too needy, too angry, so you manage yourself like a project. You monitor tone, you monitor posture, you monitor facial expressions, you turn your inner world into something that must be optimized, and it works. People see you as composed, grounded, mature. But maturity without integration becomes performance, and performance is exhausting. Have you noticed how tired you are? Not physically, psychologically. There's a quiet fatigue that comes from constantly holding parts of yourself back, from filtering your own instincts, from negotiating internally before speaking externally. You say you value peace, but what you really value is predictability. You say you're calm. But sometimes you're just numb. You say you avoid drama. But sometimes you avoid confrontation because confrontation exposes what you feel. And feeling what you feel is precisely what you've trained yourself not to do. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The more you suppress certain emotions, the more power they gain. They don't disappear. They reorganize. They move underground. They wait. And when they surface, they don't ask permission. That's why your reactions surprise even you. That wasn't like me. But what if it was? What if the version of you that reacts impulsively isn't a glitch, but a fragment? A fragment that never got integrated. A fragment you labeled as unacceptable, so you split. There's the you that behaves correctly, and the you that feels inconvenient things. You reward the first, you silence the second, and slowly, a gap forms. A gap between who you present and what you contain. The wider that gap becomes, the more fragile your sense of control gets. Because control built on repression is not stability, it's pressure. And pressure eventually demands release. The question isn't whether you're stable. The question is, how much of yourself are you actively holding down just to maintain that image? You're in the kitchen. It's late. Someone you care about makes a small comment. Why didn't you just tell me earlier? That's it. Neutral tone, casual posture, no attack, but your body reacts first. Your jaw tightens. Your chest heats up. You answer quickly. Too quickly. I didn't think it was a big deal. Your voice is sharper than you intended. They pause. You feel it immediately, the shift. Now you're defending something that wasn't even accused. The conversation escalates by half a tone. Nothing dramatic. Just enough. You withdraw. You go quiet. Later, alone, you replay it. Why did that bother me so much? Why did I react like that? It was small, it was nothing, but it wasn't nothing. It touched something older, something disproportionate. This is how it happens. Not with explosions, with microfractures, tiny overreactions, subtle defensiveness, cold silences, and afterward, guilt. You promise yourself you'll respond better next time. More measured, more mature, more controlled. But control doesn't fix what you don't understand. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." You read that and nodded. It sounded profound. But tonight, standing in your kitchen, it's less philosophical. It's personal. Because what reacted wasn't your logic. It wasn't your adult reasoning. It was something automatic, something that felt exposed. What exactly were you defending? The comment wasn't hostile, but maybe it touched a buried fear of being criticized, of being inadequate, of being misunderstood. You didn't react to the present moment. You reacted to an old wound wearing a new face. And this is the pattern. Someone cancels plans. You feel rejected. A partner hesitates. You feel unwanted. A colleague questions you. You feel disrespected. The present becomes a trigger for the past. And instead of recognizing it, you respond as if the threat is current. Then you justify it. They were insensitive. They should know better. It's normal to feel that way. Maybe. But why is your reaction always slightly bigger than the event? Why does something small feel personal? Because the part of you that holds unresolved emotion doesn't experience time the way you do consciously. It doesn't know this is 2026. It only knows the original moment when it learned, I'm not safe here. And instead of integrating that part, you tried to outgrow it. You tried to out-discipline it. You tried to mature past it. But unintegrated emotion doesn't disappear with age. It waits for a similar stimulus, then it takes the wheel. And you, the stable version of yourself, are left cleaning up the aftermath. You think you lost control, but maybe you never had it. Maybe what you call control is simply the temporary silence of something you refuse to meet. And every time it surfaces, you feel betrayed by yourself. But what if it's not betrayal? What if it's a signal? A fragment asking to be acknowledged instead of suppressed? The real question isn't, why did I overreact? The real question is, what part of me reacted and why is it still unheard? You learned very early which emotions were acceptable, which ones earned approval, which ones made people uncomfortable. Maybe anger was too much. Maybe jealousy was immature. Maybe sadness was dramatic. So you adjusted, you trimmed yourself, you became agreeable, rational, low maintenance. But nothing disappears just because you refuse to display it. It relocates. What you repress doesn't dissolve. It reorganizes in the dark. And when something lives in the dark long enough, it stops asking for permission. This is the mechanism no one explains properly. When you label a trait as unacceptable, you don't eliminate it, you exile it. And exiled parts don't integrate peacefully. They operate autonomously. They slip into your reactions. They influence your choices. They gravitate toward people who will trigger them. Not because you're self-destructive, because the psyche seeks completion. What is rejected demands expression. If you disown your anger, you attract situations that make you furious. If you disown your neediness, you attract partners who make you chase. If you disown your aggression, you'll either explode unexpectedly or tolerate disrespect far longer than you should. There is an invisible contract inside you, a silent agreement. I will not be that kind of person. Not jealous, not demanding, not insecure, not confrontational. So when those emotions arise, you don't process them. You override them. You replace them with logic. You call it self-control. But repression is not regulation. Regulation acknowledges emotion and chooses how to express it. Repression denies emotion and pretends it never existed. The body knows the difference. That tension in your shoulders, unspoken boundaries, that tightness in your stomach, unexpressed resentment, that sudden coldness when someone disappoints you, protected vulnerability. You believe you are choosing your reactions, but often you're reacting from the part you've tried hardest not to be. This is the paradox. The more you distance yourself from a trait, the more it defines you indirectly. The person who insists they are never angry is usually the one who resents quietly. The one who prides themselves on independence often fears abandonment the most. The one who claims to hate drama is magnetized toward emotionally chaotic dynamics. Because what you refuse to see in yourself, you will meet externally, and you will feel victimized by it. You'll say, "Why does this always happen to me?" But the better question is, what part of me is unconsciously seeking expression? The shadow isn't evil. It's incomplete. It holds everything you decided wasn't safe to embody, and incomplete parts don't disappear. They leak through sarcasm, through passive aggression, through overreactions, through attraction to the wrong people. You don't suffer because you have darkness. You suffer because you pretend you don't, and the cost of pretending is fragmentation. The more fragmented you are, the more fragile your control becomes. And the more fragile your control becomes, the more terrified you are of losing it. So you tighten further. You suppress harder. You refine your persona, while the shadow grows louder beneath it. The question isn't whether you have a shadow. Everyone does. The real question is, how much of your life is being directed by the parts of you refuse to claim? You say you just have bad luck in relationships, that you always end up with people who don't respect you, who don't show up consistently, who give just enough to keep you attached, but never enough to feel secure. Let's slow that down. You meet someone. They're charming, attentive. There's chemistry. But there are small signals. They cancel plans last minute. They joke about commitment. They disappear for hours without explanation. You notice it. Your body notices it immediately. There's a flicker of discomfort, but you override it. You don't want to seem demanding. You don't want to overreact. You don't want to be too much, so you adjust. You become understanding, flexible, cool. Weeks later, you feel anxious. You check your phone more often. You analyze tone. You replay conversations. When they pull back, you lean forward. When they become distant, you become accommodating. And eventually, the disrespect becomes undeniable. Now you're hurt. Now you're angry. Now you feel betrayed. But the pattern didn't start with their behavior. It started with the moment you felt the first discomfort and decided not to honor it. Here's the micro turn that's hard to swallow. You're not attracted to disrespect. You're attracted to what activates your shadow. If you've buried your need for reassurance, you'll chase emotionally unavailable people. If you've disowned your anger, you'll tolerate subtle boundary violations until you explode. If you've rejected your own neediness, you'll attach to someone who makes you prove your worth. This isn't punishment, it's unconscious magnetism. You don't consciously choose pain, but you unconsciously gravitate toward dynamics that mirror the parts of you haven't integrated. You say, "Why do I always end up here?" But look closer. There was a moment, early on, when you felt something wasn't aligned, and instead of asserting yourself, you suppressed it. Why? Because asserting it would require you to embody traits you've labeled unacceptable. Directness, anger, standards, the willingness to lose someone. So you negotiate against yourself. You shrink your expectations. You reinterpret red flags. You tell yourself you're being patient, mature, understanding. But underneath that flexibility is fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of being rejected. Fear of being seen as difficult. So you betray small parts of yourself to maintain connection. And each betrayal accumulates, until the relationship collapses under the weight of unspoken resentment. Then you swear you'll choose differently next time. But unless you integrate the parts of you that are afraid to take up space, you'll repeat it. Because the shadow doesn't just show up in anger. It shows up in who you tolerate. It shows up in what you allow. It shows up in how much of yourself you silence to be loved. You think the problem is out there. But what if the real pattern is the version of you that feels safer shrinking than risking confrontation? And if that's true, how many times have you called it love when it was actually self-abandonment? You sit in a meeting. Someone challenges your idea, not aggressively, just analytically. Your heart rate shifts, slightly, barely noticeable. You smile, you nod, you say that's a good point. But inside, something tightens. Later, you replay it. Not because the feedback was devastating, but because it felt exposing. As if your competence was briefly on trial. You don't explode. You don't argue. You adjust. You over-prepare next time. You become sharper, more precise, more guarded. This is how control disguises itself as excellence. You tell yourself you're disciplined, driven, high standard. But beneath the drive is fear. Fear of being seen as inadequate. Fear of losing respect. Fear of being ordinary. So you construct a version of yourself that rarely falters. Capable, reliable, emotionally composed. But that version requires constant tension. You cannot relax into it. Because relaxing would mean letting something unscripted surface. Maybe insecurity, maybe envy, maybe the desire to not always be the strong one. You built an identity around self-regulation. But self-regulation without self-acceptance turns into self-surveillance. You monitor your tone. You monitor your reactions. You monitor your needs. You become the manager of your own emotional image. And slowly, something disappears. Spontaneity, softness, raw honesty. You don't even remember when you stopped saying, "That hurt." Instead, you say, "It's fine." You don't remember when you stopped asking, "Can you reassure me?" Instead, you say, "I don't need anything." You call it independence. But independence that rejects vulnerability is isolation in disguise. Here's the risk sentence. You are not stable. You are contained. And containment is not the same as wholeness. Containment means holding everything in place so nothing spills. Wholeness means allowing all parts to exist without fear of collapse. The emptiness you sometimes feel, it's not lack of success, it's lack of integration. When you exile parts of yourself long enough, you become efficient, but hollow. You perform strength, but rarely experience safety. You maintain composure, but rarely experience relief. You think losing control would destroy your image. But what if the image is what's exhausting you? What if the part of you fear the most? the emotional, reactive, imperfect part, isn't your enemy, but your missing piece. Because the more tightly you grip your identity, the more fragile it becomes. And the more fragile it becomes, the more terrified you are of anything that threatens it, so you double down, you control harder, you refine further, you distance deeper, until one day you don't even recognize what you're protecting anymore. And if you're honest, when was the last time you felt fully yourself without editing anything first? There is a moment, quiet, uncomfortable, when you realize something. You are not afraid of your emotions. You are afraid of what they say about you. Anger means you are not as patient as you claim. Jealousy means you are not as secure as you pretend. Neediness means you are not as independent as you perform. So you built a version of yourself that rejects those signals. But rejection is not transcendence. Carl Jung warned, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." You don't integrate the shadow by pretending to be evolved. You integrate it by admitting what lives underneath your discipline. And this is the turning point. Not when you explode, not when you collapse, but when you stop pretending the contained version of you is the whole version of you. Because the cost of repression compounds. It costs intimacy, it costs authenticity, it costs energy. Every time you silence anger, you lose access to boundaries. Every time you silence need, you lose access to closeness. Every time you silence envy, you lose access to desire. The shadow doesn't just hold darkness, it holds vitality. And the longer you deny it, the more mechanical your life becomes. You function, you succeed, you remain composed. But something essential feels muted. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The person you are trying to protect may not even be real. It's a construct, an edited identity, a socially acceptable configuration of traits. And protecting that identity requires constant tension. Imagine for a moment what it would mean to stop defending it. Not to become chaotic, not to act out every impulse, but to admit, yes, I feel anger. Yes, I crave reassurance. Yes, I can be insecure, without shame, without panic, without turning it into a crisis. That is integration, not perfection. Wholeness. You don't lose control when you face your shadow. You gain authorship. Because what is conscious can be chosen. What is unconscious chooses for you. And if this confrontation feels destabilizing, that's because it is. It destabilizes the persona, the mask, the fragile structure of control you've maintained. But destabilization is not destruction. It's restructuring. If you're still here, still listening, it's because something in you recognizes this tension. Not intellectually, viscerally. And if you're willing to continue dismantling the patterns that quietly run your life, stay. Not for motivation, for exposure. Because this isn't about becoming better, it's about becoming less divided. The real danger isn't your anger. It isn't your jealousy, it isn't your insecurity. The real danger is remaining fragmented and calling it maturity. And the longer you delay this integration, the more your shadow will choose for you in relationships, in conflict, in ambition, in love. The question is no longer whether you have a shadow. The question is, how much longer are you willing to let it operate without your awareness? Integration is not a glow-up. It's not aesthetic. It doesn't look impressive from the outside. It looks uncomfortable because it requires you to sit with parts of yourself you've spent years refining out of visibility. It requires you to admit that the anger you judged was protecting a boundary, that the jealousy you condemned was revealing a desire, that the neediness you mocked was asking for connection. This is not about becoming darker. It's about becoming whole. When you stop exiling parts of yourself, you stop projecting them. You stop attracting dynamics that mirror what you refuse to face. You stop reacting disproportionately to situations that only trigger old wounds. But there is a cost. There is always a cost. If you integrate your anger, you will disappoint people who benefited from your silence. If you integrate your need, you will outgrow relationships built on your emotional self-sufficiency. If you integrate your ambition, you may threaten people who preferred you smaller. Wholeness changes your ecosystem. And that's why many people prefer repression. Repression preserves familiarity. Integration disrupts it. This is the rite of passage no one romanticizes. You are not stepping into a better version of yourself. You are stepping into a less edited one, less polished, less compliant, less afraid of being seen as complex. The shadow was never your enemy, it was your unfinished self. And unfinished parts don't disappear with time. They either integrate or they sabotage. There is a reason this confrontation feels existential, because it is. If you continue protecting the image, you will remain divided. If you allow the integration, you will lose the illusion of control and gain something more stable. Self-authorship, not control. Alignment. There's a line in The Forgotten Agreement by Luciana Santos that echoes here, that the most dangerous contracts are the silent ones we make against ourselves. You made one, at some point. I will not be that. Now the question is whether you're willing to break it. Not loudly, not theatrically, but internally, quietly, decisively. So I'll leave you with this. What part of yourself have you been fighting for years that might actually be asking to belong? And when you answer that, don't intellectualize it. Name it, write it, confront it. Because the shadow you refuse to face will keep directing your life. But the shadow you integrate will change who you are allowed to become. Which version of you is going to decide from now on?